Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our latest Pals and Politics, the 1st of October. Now, I don't know if any of you feel the same, but to me, it feels like September has absolutely just flown by. So I hope you've had a great month. Those of you doing A-level and IB in your politics studies, those of you who are doing other subjects, I hope that's gone well too. But yes, here we are. It's certainly moving quickly through the school year, and you probably feel the pace in your classrooms as well. So, hi everyone. My name's James, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague Don. Hi, Don.
Hello, everyone. October's my favourite month, so I'm really looking forward to the crunchy leaves and colder nights and the time to start lighting fires.
Absolutely. I like you, I love it. I was out and about today and I just love the sort of bright sun, but the crisp feel. It's a really nice time, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Fab. So welcome everyone to Pals and Politics, where we debate essay exam questions, we discuss things that are happening in the news, and we share with you some wider reading. And we're going to jump straight into it with our moments of the moment. And I don't know about you, Dom, but I felt, maybe I'm jinxing it a little here, I feel the last fortnight's been a little bit calmer than the one before. But I have, again, and I feel I'm getting typecast here, I have gone with an American example of a moment from the moment. And this is something that's actually unraveling this week. And when we watch this when it's released on Friday the 3rd, it's the date that it appears in court. But what I chose was President Trump's decision to mobilize 200 National Guard troops from the Oregon National Guard in the city of Portland in Oregon. Now, Trump has used his power as president to federalize the National Guard. A National Guard is a state army, if you like, which is usually under the control of the governor. But in times of national emergency, under something called the Insurrection Act of 1807, the president can nationalize it and federalize it, and take control of it. And this is what Trump has done. He has federalized and taken control of the Oregon National Guard and supplemented it with some federal troops. And he's deployed 200 of these troops in Portland to defend immigration centres. And now these are areas where people are being detained who are suspected of being in the country illegally, awaiting deportation. And Trump has justified using troops as saying that Portland is, and I quote, a war-ravaged city, and that the ICE centres, the immigration centres, are under attack from radical left-wing protesters. Now, evidence is mixed, but it doesn't look like on the ground we've seen the levels of uproar and civil disobedience that we've had in other moments, such as, for example, the January the 6th attacks. Why I've chosen this is I think it's a really good illustration of the relationship between state and federal government, and also the powers of the president and the need for the courts to interpret. So the Oregon governor, a lady called Tina Kotek, she has actually filed a case with the district courts in Oregon to try and block this decision. Her argument is that the president is going over his authority, that it is not a national emergency, and therefore the National Guard should remain under the control of the governor. There have been moments before, many of them, where a president has federalized the National Guard, but it has always previously been with the consent of the governor. In this, the governor has withheld that consent, and the president has gone ahead anyway, as I say, citing the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act of 1807, and this is a direct quote, it allows the president to take over when there is, quote, civil disorder, insurrection, or armed rebellion. The governor is saying these protests do not constitute that. Trump has a complicated relationship with Portland anyway. In his first term as president, he frequently criticized Portland as a city. He famously said in 2020, being in Portland was like, quote, living in hell. And he's also been very critical and federalized the National Guard and used the National Guard in other more liberal cities. So he did it for DC against what he said was violent crime, even though violent crime was down 30% in DC when he did it. And he also did it when there were protests at immigration centres in Los Angeles, which declares itself a sanctuary city. So Trump has a bit of a history here of using the National Guard in, coincidentally, shall we say, more Democrat strongholds. As I say, it's interesting because it shows you the relationship between the governor and the president, the powers between the federal government and the state governor when it comes to the National Guard. But you've also got in here as well the what's called the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which is a fundamental principle in US civil rights and liberties that the military cannot be used to enforce domestic law. And there's once again a question here, is by what they are doing, what their role is, are they essentially taking on the role of law enforcement as military officials? The other thing I would say is quite interesting about this is it shows once again the power of the courts. As I say, this is going to the courts to decide, to interpret, does the president have the right, without the consent of the governor, to trigger a National Guard deployment and federalisation? And the Friday the 3rd is the day it goes into the district court. Many commentators believe this could be a case that progresses up through the courts quite quickly. Given the nature of the situation, it could potentially reach the Supreme Court, who would once again have to rule, as we discussed this a lot in our last podcast, once again rule on a very current political issue, a very controversial current political issue, because the branches of government, in this case state and federal, cannot work together. That compromise and bipartisanship that the founding fathers envisaged when they created checks and balances and separation of powers is not there. So it'll be really interesting to see how that comes out. And then finally, on top of all of this, you've got the human stories. You've got the stories of the protesters. You've got the stories of the people who are being detained in the centre and whether or not immigration policy is the right course of action. And you've got also the sense that it feeds into Trump's agenda as president as well. And those of you who are looking at comparative theories, the rational basis for why Trump might be doing this in terms of appealing to his base and also fulfilling what he sees as a central 2024 election promise. Dom, have you got any thoughts on this one?
I saw quite a few people posting like TikToks and Reels saying here's the war ravaged city, and then it's the fish market in Portland. It's them queuing up at artisanal bakeries and cafes and stuff, and it's funny. Obviously around the ICE centers themselves there's definitely some evidence of protests, but there is some suggestion that Trump was shown videos during the George Floyd protests that were going on at Portland, and he's using those videos as justification for this. So I think that's another aspect. And obviously the ongoing, as you pointed out, the ongoing battle, essentially, it kind of defines this whole presidency of just how powerful can the president get. Yeah. And we're just seeing this time and again. He's expanding the presidential power. He's pushing it as far as he can go. And it's just going to end up in the Supreme Court, which, as we know, is a conservative court and are more likely, though not definitely, going to side with the president in some of these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right there. Really, that whole idea of elastic theory that executive power can be stretched definitely is something I think we can definitely see happening. It's almost like he's on a race with himself to get as much of his agenda done as he can in the time that he has. So Fab, that's me. Dom.
Mine's not going to be as comprehensive, but obviously it's party conference season, which some of you may have been to conference as young members of parties. I've been to a couple in my time. And this moment of the moment is Keir Starmer's speech, which was today. And it was a pretty wide-ranging speech. I think it was probably his 7th or 8th attempt at restarting his government. You can see Renew Britain right there. That's kind of the theme of his speech. He spoke about things like apprenticeships. He spoke about taking tough decisions on migration. He mentioned the elephant in the room, which was the budget. And interestingly, he mentioned the Conservatives a lot more than reform. And that is interesting because when Ed Davey had of the Liberal Democrats had his speech, he mentioned Labour once, he didn't mention the Conservatives, and he only spoke about reform. So Labour are apparently internally worried that they've given too much oxygen to the Reform Party and that they are accidentally causing them to get more media attention. So he wanted to draw it back to the Conservatives, where they feel they're on much more comfortable ground and they can try and take the fight to them instead of to Reform. I think it's also interesting is that there were a lot of flags as well. This idea of, and the Lib Dems did it as well, trying to reclaim patriotism and reclaim what the flag of England and the flag of the UK means. And I think that was noticed very obviously. They gave the whole conference flags to wave about as well. And there's still the tricky decision of what Rachel Reeves does in the budget. And she obviously had her speech yesterday. Keir Starmer referenced some of the difficult decisions that they would make and have to make to repair what again, blaming the Conservatives on this, what the Conservatives had done when they were in power. And then we've got the Conservative one next week, which is also going to be a lightning moment, because Kemi Badenoch is down in the polls. Some polls put her as in 4th position in terms of the Conservatives, and they're facing extremely high chances of almost extinction levels if the polls bear out for a general election. And the hidden message is who would take over from Keir Starmer. You had Andy Burnham sniping from the sidelines, suggesting internal party fractious moments, and apparently in polling of Labour members in a straight Keir Starmer Andy Burnham contest, Andy Burnham would win. But would Andy Burnham then win against Reform? And obviously Andy Burnham's not even an MP, so there's so many hurdles to him even getting to that spot, which is why he's now quietly backed off, because he's starting to, I would assume, realize that his chances are slim to none of this very convoluted way in which he would become Prime Minister happening.
And the other danger of that is then they just look like the Conservatives again, don't they? And just changing leaders, not really focused on the problems at hand, driven by internal politics, which would just be a gift for Reform.
Exactly, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, really interesting. And I think as you allude to, the Conservative one next week will be fascinating. And it's interesting, Boris Johnson, about a year ago, he advised the Conservative leadership, don't mention Farage, ignore Farage. That's the best strategy. And I don't think Kemi Badenoch has really taken it on board, but it's like you said there, the more oxygen you give him, the brighter he will burn. Yeah. So two really interesting moments for the moment there, both playing out as we speak. So obviously you're watching this on Friday. We're recording on the Wednesday night, so that's why we're talking about what's happening today. And you might be thinking that wasn't today, but that's why. Okay, so we're going to move into our debate. And Dom, do you want to sort of outline why we've chosen this question?
Yeah, and it's a great question. So examine the extent to which NATO is still relevant and useful in the 21st century. And this is for those that are studying global politics. It's an edXL question, so it'll be 30 marks. And in terms of answering it, you're answering it in the same way, is you are including arguments for, including arguments against. Your paragraphs are still laid out in the same way. Nothing changes in that sense. And you're still writing 4 paragraphs, 3 very chunky paragraphs, or 4 less chunky paragraphs with an introduction, a conclusion. But we thought we'd add global politics because it's an important part of politics. I taught it for 6 years prior to going back to American politics. And time and again, the NATO question comes up. More often than not, it's a 9-mark question. That is always talking about what are the powers of NATO, or examine the criticisms of NATO, or examine the arguments for NATO. And it's some variation of that, but it can still come up as an extended essay question as well, which is why we're tackling it today.
Yeah, and I taught when this question came up when I used to teach the IB global politics. NATO was obviously a big feature of international governance in that as well. So those of you doing the IB, hopefully it will add some, even if the question's slightly different, the content will hopefully still be really useful to you. So Dom, you're going to kick us off.
Yeah. So arguments for why NATO is still relevant and useful in the 21st century. Article 5. Okay, so Article 5 is the idea that if one member of NATO is attacked and activates Article 5, all other NATO members are duty bound to respond and support them and essentially do what is asked of them, depending on what the country wants. It's only ever been activated once, and that was in response to 9/11. And what's interesting here is that it's still an important principle. It is still the reason why Russia, and that is the big thing that we're going to keep talking about when we talk about this particular essay, because Russia is the threat that NATO is responding to, or did respond to, as it was the USSR when NATO was first created. NATO and Russia has not attacked a NATO member. Now, we'll get into Poland in a moment, but the reason why it's not, I can see James already like, but.
I'm resisting the urge.
Yes, it hasn't. And the reason it hasn't is because it knows Article 5 is a duty-bound principle in which they would essentially be swamped by all of these other countries that will happily, with the support of the US, again, another thing that we'll talk about, will respond very aggressively to a NATO Russia conflict. So not only that, but when Poland was attacked, there was an incursion on its border via Russian drones. They activated what's called Article 4. Now, Article 4 says every NATO member must send a representative to the country to have a conversation about how to respond to what's happened. And everyone did. So we've seen that NATO will respond if its members request it to. I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about there, James.
No, I'll get into the crux of my arguments in a minute, but yeah, I think you are right. Article 5 is a hugely important principle, and what I would caveat my counter to is that NATO was hugely relevant and hugely useful in the period of 1949 to the end of the Cold War. It was one of the bedrocks of security of the 20th century, and I will strongly maintain and agree that it's why conflict did not break out in Europe directly between the two sides. My argument would be that actually it's not relevant now. And I think what you were saying there about Poland is true. They did meet, but the fact that Russia still felt comfortable to even try it, I think, is a sign of the diminishing of that status, power, and threat, and for all the reasons I'll go into shortly.
Yeah, you're not wrong, and that's a really good counter point. Is if Russia felt it was able to, then that just demonstrates that perhaps NATO is not relevant, and that Russia felt that it was able to successfully test the boundaries against the borders of NATO. Which brings me nicely on to my next point in terms of internal governance. So NATO funding. Now, the NATO funding that NATO was founded on was everyone in NATO, every country in NATO must contribute 2% of its GDP to defense funding. And it was a founding principle, like Article 5, that if you join NATO, then you must fund your defense properly. And the problem that Donald Trump in particular, back in his first go at the presidency, was that he very rightly pointed out that NATO was not being funded properly, and that some countries were essentially getting a free ride, and they were not funding their defence properly. They were contributing 1.5% lower, and whereas the US was contributing significantly higher, hitting 3.84% of their GDP to NATO. And essentially, NATO was being carried by the US. However, what Donald Trump rightly did, from his perspective, was say, look, we're going to ask everyone, essentially demanded, you fund your military better, you fund your defense better, or we won't come and protect you. And NATO members, countries, essentially got scared, and they said, if we play chicken in this moment, we could end up without our most important ally. And then what do? Then we're very vulnerable. And thus, NATO funding amongst all partners increased significantly in some respects. And there are now some countries that actually pay more into NATO as a percentage of their GDP than the US does. And it affects internal domestic politics across all countries, like it has in the UK, where it became a big thing during the election of just how much money were you going to put into defense? Is it 2.5%? Is it 2.8? Is it 3? Is it over 3? And it became like this ladder of just what did the Conservatives say they were going to put in? What did Labour say they were going to put in terms of funding? So it has a really big impact. But as a result, is we are now committed to increasing our defence funding to 3% by 2030. And as a result, we are, NATO as a whole, better able to cope with upcoming potential conflicts. So moving on to my final point is changing threats. So NATO, the purpose of NATO originally, as we've spoken about, was to cope with the USSR. USSR was huge, it was extremely powerful, and individually those countries on the Iron Curtain border could not individually cope with the threat of the USSR next to it. So learning from history, learning from World War I, we thought, oh, let's join together. Let's create a defensive pact. Now, it's important to remember that it is a defensive pact as well. So it doesn't go and commit incursions, for example. It wouldn't actively go and fight a war. It would have to wait to be attacked first because it is a defensive alliance. That's quite an important thing to remember if you're talking about relevancy and usefulness as well. But obviously the USSR doesn't exist anymore. So what does NATO do instead? NATO has had some renewal recently, and they have looked internally and they have set out their new missions, looking to the future. And obviously it's changed. The nature of warfare has changed. You might have seen in the news the uptick in cyber attacks happening in Denmark, happening in the UK as well. Jaguar Land Rover, for example, suffered quite significantly recently, M&S and so on. But some of those might have been state actors, some of them might have been individuals. But NATO has improved and is making a point of improving its cyber defense operations. It's also expanded its mission purpose outside the original purpose of stopping the spread of communism and containing the USSR. And now it does things like tackle pirates along trade routes to prevent ships from being attacked and goods being stolen. So NATO has proven that it is flexible. It's also looking at expanding into, and it has started to expand into space, so for space warfare as well. So there is evidence that, and you can see that I'm hesitating here because I know what James is going to say, is that there is evidence that it is being flexible. James, over to you for your arguments against, and I already know what you're going to say for all of them, but I think it's worth remembering that look at the question, still relevant, still useful in the 21st century. Keep that in mind when you're hearing James's points.
I would like to just stress to everyone that I put mine down first, so Don got to respond to what my arguments were, which I think shows you the strength of the arguments. Before I begin, though, I'll just add on to the point I made at the start about Russia feeling it was able to do the drones. It also feels able to get submarines up close to national waters, to test air boundaries with bombers and jets. We're not just talking, this isn't a one-off. This confidence in testing those boundaries has been happening regularly over the last 20 odd years. So I would just sort of add that first to lump it with the point I made earlier. So as I said, my central argument is that NATO was incredibly valuable, incredibly useful, incredibly relevant in the 20th century. However, its origins are very much, they went out with the Cold War. The NATO was set up at a time when we had a very clear enemy, the USSR. It was focused on conventional military fighting and nuclear strategy, when very much threats to states were from specific states. That made Article 5, as Dom rightly says, that made Article 5 really relevant, because interactions between states were state versus state. You could very clearly tell who your enemy was, and you could very clearly assess whether or not you had been attacked or you were under threat. That has changed in the 21st century. The nature of states has changed, the nature of warfare has changed, the relationship between groups that commit attacks and state governments has changed, and therefore, whilst great in the 20th century, it's not equipped, and its origins and its intentions are not compatible with the 21st century. And I would also say that it's a very Europe-focused organization. I know Dom talks about expanding out into other things and even in space, but ultimately it's grounded in Europe. Most of its countries are in Europe. However, if you look at where the global hotspots are around the world now, yes, obviously we have Ukraine, which isn't in NATO, but actually, if you look at where global problems are, you've got China and Taiwan, you've got Iran and Israel, India and Pakistan. Now, they are all huge conflicts in which NATO is not really relevant or useful at all in managing. And I would also say when NATO has been involved in conflicts in the 21st century, so I'm thinking here Afghanistan, I'm thinking Libya, I'm thinking about ways in which it does try and support Ukraine, it hasn't been hugely successful. We know that, for example, in Afghanistan, it didn't stop the return of the Taliban in 2021. In Libya, its missions completely changed from presenting genocide to regime change, which then left a huge vacuum, which led to the rise of ISIL in the Middle East. We look at Ukraine, its commitment is inconsistent to Ukraine within NATO. So it hasn't had huge success in managing these changes of conflict, these more modern conflicts. And as I say, a lot of these hotspots are now in parts of the world that NATO was not set up to deal with. So I would say it achieved its objective in the 20th century. It kept the peace, it defended Western Europe, but that is no longer the goal for NATO. So I would say it's not to take away from its history or to take away from its worth in the 20th, but it's not there in the 21st. I'd also say, and I'd encourage you to look this scholar up. He's a great scholar if you're talking about global politics, and particularly the US. It's a man called John Mearsheimer, who's a realist scholar in American foreign policy. And he actually argues that NATO, since the end of the Cold War, has created what he calls a strategic blunder. And that actually by allowing all these countries into NATO, which had been previously NATO's enemies, so we're talking about Eastern Europe, by allowing these countries in, NATO has moved its border closer and closer and closer to Russia. And whilst NATO might be a defensive organization, i.e. it's there to respond, not attack, if you are Russia, you can very clearly see the argument that it's the encroachment of Western influence onto the Russian border. and therefore by allowing these countries in has actually provoked Russia into the conflicts it's had since the end of the Cold War. So if you look at Georgia, if you look at Crimea, if you look at Ukraine today, Mearsheimer would argue that actually this is a response to Russia feeling that it is being surrounded and threatened by NATO. It has actually caused the problems in Europe that NATO was set up to try and avoid. And that is because NATO has expanded and expanded and expanded into Russian territory. And I don't think you have to look into history much to see how America, the US, has responded when countries have got close to its borders. The Cuban Missile Crisis was set up because Russian influence moved into Cuba 90 miles away from Florida. American involvement in World War One, going back over 100 years, American involvement in World War One only happened when actually Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico and the fear of German influence on its own border. So for America to discount the idea that this hasn't caused Russia to act as it does is questionable. And I'd also say as well that when the conversations about German reunification were happening at the end of the Cold War, many Western leaders actually said to Russia that NATO would not expand eastwards. So Russia does feel that sense of betrayal. And we have a Russian president who was obviously in the KGB in the Cold War, who operates through this viewpoint. And it can only get worse if NATO continues to expand. So I would say the geopolitical arguments there mean that it was great in the 20th century, not so much in the 21st. Before I move on, Dom, do you want to come back on any of that?
I think it's so if you look at it from you mentioned a realist perspective, you look at it from a liberal perspective. So obviously international liberalism, which very much favors interconnectedness and alliances and joining supranational organizations like the EU, like the IMF, like WTO, like NATO, is that countries should feel perfectly free to join whichever alliance they want to, regardless of external factors. You think about a country like Ukraine, which was talking about looking at NATO ascension, that shouldn't threaten Russia. None of those expansions should threaten Russia because Russia left those countries, and those countries exercising independence have the right to decide what to do with their own destiny. And yes, the expansionism is the blame from Russia's perspective, but merely joining a defensive alliance should not be punished in the way that it has.
And I think that's the question. We're in the difference here between what should happen and what realists would say what realistically happens. And I think you're right that they're two perspectives that are rooted in two different ideologies and two different views of human nature and two different worldviews. But for this case, I think it's a very safe argument for you to make in an essay, the Mearsheimer argument, because it is the central justification for Russia's point of view. Don's already preempted some of my criticism here with internal governance, but it does still heavily rely on the United States. 2/3 of the budget for NATO comes from the United States. Even now, 2/3 of the entire operating budget. And once again, it's ultimately an alliance which does protect everyone, but it's largely for the benefit of Europe. And European countries, many of which have huge financial challenges themselves, have not been able to contribute to the running of NATO. And I would argue that actually this has led to NATO being their own worst enemy, in the sense that it's created in the US, the key contributor, as Dom agrees, a sense that NATO just isn't worth the money. And actually, if you look at MAGA, if you look at Make America Great Again, if you look at MAGA supporters who see a much more isolationist view for America, in a large part it's because they don't feel that NATO countries are carrying their weight. It's all down to the American taxpayer, many of which would argue they have economic problems themselves. I think as well, when it's not just money, if you look at what's weaponry supply, once again, that is still largely the United States. When European countries have been trying to give weapons to Ukraine, they've actually been running out, and they've been actually they've been using up all of their peacetime resources and going into their own wartime resources, because they just cannot keep up. It's why there's been so much effort to try to help Ukraine make its own weaponry, because the European countries just don't have the ability to carry the burden that the US does. The EU has just admitted to missing its own targets for supply of weapons to Ukraine, because it just cannot generate the materials that are needed. You've also obviously got the fact that European Union bureaucracy rules around trade. There's a lot of protectionist elements to it. Also make it very hard to trade and give weapons and sell weapons to Ukraine. So once again, it's very much on the US, and that means the entire relevance and usefulness of NATO is in the hands of the United States, which at the moment sees, as I said earlier, bigger challenges with China, which sees bigger challenges with Iran, which sees bigger challenges about India and Pakistan's potential nuclear standoff over Kashmir. Actually, Russia is not the big concern for the Trump administration. It's becoming increasingly so, but its focus is outside of Europe, which once again also reinforces that NATO and European security is not as relevant, is not as important as those wider geopolitical changes. And I would also say as well that I would argue that the idea that NATO is still relevant and useful is being made by those in the military-industrial triangle, in those corporations that make weaponry, that sell security services, that operate consultancy over global security. They have an agenda to push for NATO continuing to be relevant and useful. So Dom's talked about, yes, they are getting involved in things like anti-piracy and they're getting involved in cyber defense, but that is because there's huge money in that. So there are two groups I'd encourage you to look into. The first is called the Industrial Capacity Expansion Pledge. Now, this is basically where a group of American defense contractors have agreed to supply and increase industrial output of weaponry to NATO countries, and using NATO's justification to be able to win those contracts, and crucially, the agreement from the US government, because under US law, you have to have permission to sell weapons to a foreign state. Now, obviously, being part of NATO means that they can do that. The second thing I would also say is to look into is the Defense Production Action Plan, which is once again where US companies, defense companies, have been allowed to work with NATO to provide consultancy and expertise on these new changing threats, to prop up the financial advantage that creates. And finally, I'll let Dom come back in a minute, just in terms of changing threats and frameworks, I would argue, yes, Dom's right that NATO is trying to emerge in these fields, but it's much harder to do because NATO fundamentally is about state actors. And Article 5 is much more ambiguous when it comes to saying, have you been attacked in turn by a state, when it might be a terrorist organization, a cyber hacker in their bedroom. Actually, it's much harder to utilize NATO because of these new types of warfare. You don't have clear invasions of NATO, of countries in the same way anymore. Ukraine, obviously, being exception in Europe. Where there are attacks now on NATO countries, they're done in such what we call salami slices. They're incremental. So actually, you can't warrant a full-on retaliation of Russia because of a few drones. But the drones are the first point. You then try something else. It's salami tactics. Much harder to actually trigger Article 5 in that. And as I say, they're not state actors, a lot of these groups. The Taliban obviously was the government of Afghanistan and provided some support. But obviously, They were not. That was not sanctioned officially by the government of Afghanistan. 9/11 was not sanctioned by the government of Afghanistan. When they went in to Afghanistan, the US went in, it was because they had supported them, not that they had done it. So the relationships are really different. And I've just finished as well by saying that I think NATO is increasingly being replaced by new security frameworks that are emerging around the world. If you look, for example, at AUKUS, which is the Australia, UK, US, and soon to be New Zealand defense arrangements, which are much more focused on the Indo-Pacific, Chinese expansion. If you look at the Five Eyes, which is the intelligence sharing, satellite communications, human intelligence sharing of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, and the UK. If you look at the fast growing EU defense arrangements, so you've got the rapid deployment capacity, which is their emergency 5,000 troops. You look at the military planning and conduct capability group. If you look at the European Defence Fund, which funds research and development into new European weaponry. If you look at the European Peace Facility, which talks about integrating military systems. If you talk about the permanent structured cooperation since 2017, and they've just set up Strategic Compass, which is another way of trying to bring all of the operations within Europe together. You've got all these new frameworks. Now, my question to you would be, if NATO was still relevant and was still useful, why are we seeing a proliferation around the world of America and Europe and the UK, but also engaging in other organizations? And why, for example, are other organizations like not trying to join NATO? So I think what you're seeing is a recognition that NATO's relevance is now limited, its usefulness is now limited, and new security frameworks have to come into place. Dom.
Okay. So agree with a lot of what you're saying, because it is evidential that, you know, NATO's, you could argue, is very much in decline. Emmanuel Macron, this is a great quote for your essays, declared that NATO, and this is a quote, is brain dead, and he criticized the overall direction of NATO. But this is where you're weighing your arguments, and you'll see this in the conclusion. This is where you weigh your arguments, is that NATO as a security actor, as a defensive alliance, is still stopping Russian expansion. Russia chose to expand into Ukraine, not into Poland, not into any of the Baltic states that are in NATO. It chose the one that wasn't in NATO. If NATO wasn't relevant and wasn't useful, then why did it choose instead to go to Ukraine rather than an actual NATO country? And the answer is because it is still scared, still concerned, because it can't predict what NATO would do. And a theme, by the way, of all of global politics, just going back to James's second point about internal governments, is how much it all depends on the US, right? How much does the Western world depend on the US, whether it's in the IMF, whether it's in the World Trade Organization, the UN? It's all at the whims of the US. So examine the extent to which NATO is still relevant and useful in the 21st century. You could replace NATO with the word the United States, and the two are inexorably tied together. So as America faces challenges in the polarity of superpowers globally, so too does NATO, because they are linked. They are one and the same in some respects. And when you have an erratic, and I use this term in the pejorative sense, an erratic president making decisions that can't be predicted, so too does NATO become less relevant and less useful, because it doesn't have leadership, it doesn't have guidance. NATO is stronger when it's got consistency. And that means that it ebbs and flows with essentially the US presidency. Yeah,
I mean, I think what we can both agree on is that it's relevant and useful because of Russia.
Yes.
That's very much, I would say, it's 20th century origin and philosophy. If Russia had stopped being a threat, and Russia had gone a different way to Putin, it carried on the more liberal Yeltsin agenda as it started with, I don't think NATO would be as relevant. I also don't think many Eastern European countries would have wanted to join had that been the case. But
No, I would agree.
NATO is in serious need of reform, and I would say there's three parts to this. It cannot be reliant on the United States, as you say. That causes, I think, disenchantment in the US with NATO, but it also, as we're seeing with Ukraine, means that NATO cannot adopt a unified position. Secondly, it needs to determine what its role is in modern warfare. And thirdly, it needs to sustain its internal credibility, in part to secure US support, but also to show countries like Russia that it is still, unfortunately, and I know they invaded Ukraine, they didn't invade Poland and so forth. I also think there's historical parts of reason why they went for Ukraine, and also the mineral wealth that Ukraine has. But yes, but ultimately, I would just finish off by challenging one of your points about NATO funding. That yes, a lot of European countries are upping their budgets, but the money isn't. If you look at how some of these European countries are spending that extra increase, it's not going on increased weaponry. It's not going on new hardware. It's not going into research and development. It's going into pay for soldiers. It's going into the conditions of wages and salaries. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but actually it shows, one, that actually they still don't get what America wants from them in terms of their role in NATO. And two, it undermines the credibility of those countries and their claims to take it seriously, which then has a direct impact on US support. And as the world faces wider challenges, as we say, from China, Iran, India, Pakistan, NATO cannot be divided. And if it is, it's actually doing more harm than good.
Yeah, I'm not going to push back on those because I agree largely. I think it's in your conclusions, it depends what you want to emphasize. I'm saying yes, that it is still relevant, but only just. It doesn't have the flexibility that Russia or China has to maneuver itself. It can't invest in itself, as James was talking about, in the same way that states can. Some states are getting around the defense budget restraints by labeling things like, pensions for soldiers, for example, or things like that. And is that really what the US wants? The answer is no, it's not. The US wants physical evidence that the budget's increasing, either through hiring more soldiers, for example, building more tanks, for example, things like that, things that are tangible rather than paying out for things like pensions. It has it both has and hasn't stopped in succeeding in stopping Russian expansion. Russia is still aggressive, as we've seen. It's still testing boundaries, but obviously it hasn't gone so far as to directly attack a NATO country. But James is right in that can Poland shoot down those drones and then claim Article 5 and say everyone needs to come and support me now, when Putin can just say those drones were going to a different place, or it was an accident, or you're overreacting. It's not quite the same as when the US activated Article 5. And then how far can, again, Russia push its boundaries, push its and test its limits against NATO before one of them does go, this is too much. Thus, is NATO still relevant? Yes, but only very much just.
And it's sad because, as I said, I really think it was a hugely powerful force in the 20th century. But I think the very fact that it has deteriorated shows that actually how rooted NATO's relevance and use was in the Cold War context.
Yeah.
Okay.
But times change, don't they?
They do, absolutely. And I think that's why I was talking about new security frameworks coming up in response, and why so many of them are geared around the Indochina region.
Yeah.
Now.
The Indo-China pivot.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to finish off as we always do by what we have been reading in the last week or so. So we're going to start with you, Dom, and there is a much older looking Barack Obama than I remember being in office.
Look, presidency ages people. So what I'm reading, it's a bit of a cop out, guys. Sorry, but what I'm reading is actually me going to the O2 to see an audience with Barack Obama. And it's just the reason why I put it on here is to remind you that it's not just books. You can talk about lectures that you've been to, head talks that you've watched, future learn courses that you've done. It doesn't just have to be confined to reading. It could be taking away a memorable quote. I will say, by the way, in terms of my review of Obama, he was his most philosophical and ponderous at this particular event. I think he tried very hard not to commit the mistake of making news, and he still ended up making news by, in his words, criticizing his successor. He never referred to Trump by name. He just called him his successor. But it was nice to see, and it was nice to walk down memory lane when NATO was still relevant during Obama's presidency.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Obama's foreign policy, to be honest, but that's a topic for a whole other conversation.
Oh, it definitely is. Definitely is.
Well, I am starting my third master's this week. I've got my first session. Well, you'll be watching this on Friday. I'll be in my seminar. And I'm looking at I'm doing a master's called Global Challenges, History, Policy and Practice. And it's all about looking at global challenges and how you can try and use policy and advocacy to overcome them. And one of the things, I've put this because I've only really been doing reading for my course this week, it is all about the relationship between historians and policymakers. And can historians be policymakers? Or is it that actually you cannot take one historical event and learn from it and transpose it into a current historical event? And it's all about actually how policymakers would benefit from more historians working in policy, and historians would benefit from more policymakers acting as historians and actually taking events and applying a much more scholarly approach to analysis of past events to inform future decisions, rather than necessarily politicizing history and reaching for analogies. So a common one that is often used in policymaking in the US is the Vietnam analogy. And the Vietnam analogy is used by policymakers to argue all sorts of different things without actually any real in-depth analysis of what actually happened in Vietnam. So it's a really interesting book about the relationships between historians and policymakers. If you're doing history as well as politics, it's definitely worth a read. It's a great overlap. And if any of you are thinking about going into policy or going into think tanks, or going into civil service, it's also a really good read as well, because it talks a lot about using academic study to help shape policy in response to global challenges. So yes, I am looking forward to starting that on Friday. I'm going to be a student again. How exciting!
No, I mean it does sound interesting. I think the problem is at the core of this is that the aims of scholars and historians and politicians is just perhaps too different. Is that electionability and the desire to win the next election, short-termism is a real factor in why policies get made, and you can't take a longer view of history, as one Barack Obama would say, and that really hampers the ability to install those historians and policymakers in the same place.
Yeah, and also when you're a policymaker, you're often dealing with time-sensitive crisis events where you're trying to find answers quite quickly. You don't have time to commission a 6-month scholarly examination of various historical case studies and arrive at a conclusion. That would not be conducive to good response to crises either. Okay, so yeah, 2 really interesting books for you to read there. So that is us. That is this fortnight's Pals and Politics. As always, please let us know any feedback. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe on there. It's also on the PEF's website, which you can see at the bottom. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, which will just be before half term, I'm guessing, Dom.
Yes, it will be.
There's something to look forward to for everyone there. And we will see what the next fortnight holds in our world. And let's see if Kami Badenoch still is the leader of the Conservatives in 2 weeks' time. Or even if
we shall see.
Or has Andy Burnham made his move? We'll see. Love to see you all. Thank you for joining us. As ever, I'm James.
I'm Dom.
It's been great to have you with us. Thank you for your time, everyone. Enjoy your fortnight.